Together with the other girls, she started a small sex business. Welcome to another episode of Criminal Patrol. Today we have a story that is, I would say, controversial in some way, debatable, not obvious. Sometimes we deal with exactly these kinds of topics. This one concerns prostitution among minors, but also often simply children. Recently, a few days ago, sensational news spread across Poland about several girls from a home. A children's home in Polkowice, which is in the Copper Basin, set up an escort agency and provided sexual services. This will be the backdrop for what we want to talk about today, but I also think it's a backdrop for you to have a discussion. I invite you to watch the next episode. How many people use so-called paid love? Of course, it's hard to say for sure. There are studies on this topic. Depending on who conducts the research and what they want to prove, of course, these statistical fluctuations are, so to speak, drastically different. According to these studies, roughly 14% of men admit to using these services. Prostitutes, women admit to it, and only 0.5%. Whether to believe it or not, you have to decide for yourselves. But how many people use the services of underage prostitutes or seek out love? That's hard to say, because basically no one will admit to it. Because if such a girl is under 15 years old, it's simply a crime. If she's a bit older, 16 or 17 years old, sometimes it's just shame. Well, then no one is likely to admit to it. And basically, we don't have such research. So does underage prostitution exist in Poland? And how widespread is it? Well, we will try to answer that in some way today. Certainly these children, because the story begins with girls in an orphanage, these children who end up in an orphanage, I would say, require special care. These are not easy children. They often have broken spirits, not through any fault of their own, because, for example, they had the misfortune of ending up with terrible parents. But thanks to the vigilance of the people who take care of them in such orphanages, they often manage to set these children on the right path. In this case, concerning what happened in Poland, in Polkowice, the vigilant ones were the caregivers, who realized quite quickly that something bad was happening in this center. Wiktoria. Wiktoria is 19 years old today. She appeared at the orphanage in Polkowice last year. That was exactly in July 2023. Well, from the very beginning, it was clear that Wiktoria, despite being only 19, already had a lot of experience and connections, because she knew, for example, drug dealers, especially those who sell methamphetamine. And Wiktoria also made herself known as a resourceful girl who likes and knows how to make money. As soon as she showed up, she immediately made contact with two other girls. They're 2 years younger. At that time, they were 17 years old. The girls also wanted to use drugs. So Wiktoria said that she would provide them with the drugs, but of course not for free. A dose cost 25 zlotys. Usually it was either one dose or two doses for 50 zlotys. How many times did she supply them? Probably around a dozen times. Here, thanks to the vigilance of the people who work there, the educators, they quickly realized that there was simply something wrong with those girls. That they are, to put it bluntly, under the influence of drugs. They also quickly connected that the drugs appeared at the same time when Wiktoria showed up at the center. The director of the orphanage didn't wait. He quickly notified the police. On July 10, 2023, the police came to the center and detained Wiktoria as well as several other girls from the center. Up to this point, it seemed that the case was, let's say, rather ordinary, that it was simply about drug use, and that's the direction the investigation initially took. When the police officers from Polkowice started to look deeper into the case, it turned out that drugs weren't the only thing. That Wiktoria, together with the other girls, set up a small sex business. It was based on the fact that these two 17-year-olds were engaged in prostitution. Wiktoria persuaded them to do this right after they arrived. She told them that you can make good money, that basically the work is easy, and that the money from it can be substantial. First, she persuaded the girls. Then she set up accounts for them on adult websites. She also took a few sexy photos of them. And she also recorded a few such videos on her phone. And she kept those videos on her phone. And then they started posting ads, and indeed clients started reaching out. Wiktoria took 100 zlotys from each girl for every client. But this business, the sex business, didn't last long. It only lasted about 5 days. It didn't really get going, but there was every chance it could have continued. And as it turns out, it was bringing in quite a lot of income. When the police realized what was going on and gathered the evidence, Wiktoria was charged with several offenses. These were charges related to things like pimping, meaning that she facilitated prostitution, helped the girls, and most importantly, profited from it, because that's the essence of it. Crimes, in addition to that, she was making pornographic films, because she would send the videos she had with the girls to interested clients for money, so she was charged with a second offense of making pornographic films and a third one related to drug dealing. Altogether, this 19-year-old girl, Wiktoria, faces a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. We don't know what the market is like, what the scale of this market is, or the scale of these services provided by underage girls and boys, because it goes in that direction as well. It seems that in recent years this market has grown. One of the clients who used the services of a 16-year-old girl said that 16-year-old girl S are simply cheaper. And secondly, they agree to things that an experienced prostitute simply wouldn't agree to, that you can get away with more with them. It also seems that there is quite a lot of social acceptance for this kind of sex with minors. There also aren't, I would say, any special programs for situations when, for example, a girl ends up in a children's home, and before that, for a long time, she had to fend for herself and was involved in prostitution. So when she ends up in a children's home, there isn't any program for her that would help her simply get out of prostitution. I also mentioned the widespread social acceptance that this is the way things are. This is another case, a case that happened in a rather small town in Zambrów, because for many months there, the local community, and not just them, but all of Poland, was caught up in a certain sex scandal. One of the girls, of those girls who were, well, that's what we have to call it, prostitutes, was 16-year-old Ewelina from the Orphanage. Ewelina ended up in the orphanage because her parents simply argued, were getting divorced, and she didn't have anyone to take care of her. When she ended up in the orphanage, she realized that another friend of hers was also a prostitute. She asked her what it was like. She decided that she wanted to do the same. She wanted to make money, and she didn't have much resistance to it. And that's exactly what happened. During the trial, this 16-year-old girl, Evelina, said that she didn't regret what she did. She only regretted that they paid so little. But when the emotions subsided, the 16-year-old Evelina later on tried to commit suicide. She realized what was being said about her, what kind of those people who took advantage of her thought about her. She tried to kill herself. She was saved at the last moment. She's somehow trying to recover and keep on living. For some time now, there have been reports in Zambrów that young bodies are in demand. This information also reached the local police officers, and they started to follow this lead. In fact, they quickly realized that the clues led directly to the orphanage, that it was two 16-year-old underage prostitutes offering their services in the city. But from all of this, well, I would say in some way it was the elite of this town who took advantage of it, because the police rather quickly reached several businessmen, a developer, a local doctor who drove a gold BMW, but they also reached two of their own colleagues, two police officers, who also had no qualms about using the services of these 16-year-old girls. Of course, a scandal broke out because it turned out that for many months, many men from this town had been using the services of underage prostitutes. In total, the police identified 6 such men who are well known and respected in this town. They hold, I would say, prominent professions, and above all, they are wealthy. The prosecutor's office also states that this cannot be allowed, that it is a crime, that charges must be brought against them, and an indictment must be sent to the court. In the materials that appeared, there was no article under which the prosecutor's office formulated the charges, but it seems that they simply concerned a crime involving the exploitation of a minor's difficult situation and leading them to another sexual act. It also seems that the prosecutor's office was convinced that we were dealing with a crime, and indeed, in the first instance, there were convictions. In total, these verdicts concerned 4 men and also 2 police officers, so altogether it was 6 people. The police officers automatically lost their jobs as well, but they were dismissed or fired because they were accused of unethical behavior. The case continued, it went to higher courts, and then the matter didn't seem so obvious anymore. The regulations also changed. It was determined that it's not the case that someone is taking advantage of a person's difficult situation and, in a way, forcing them into sex by helping them somehow or making that help dependent on them being nice to him. Well, it turned out, and the girls themselves admitted it, that they were the ones who approached, solicited, and offered their services. Since that's the case, the court did not find a crime because it's a completely different matter to cause sexual contact with another person, meaning forcing them into such contact or exerting some pressure. And it's something else entirely to have relations with such a person with their consent or even at their suggestion. These are 2 different things. As you can see, in law, these nuances, usually unnoticeable, are quite clear because they determine whether someone is a criminal or not. But to avoid complicating everything, it ended up with the court stating that all the gentlemen are simply innocent. Since the girls wanted it, since they walked around, encouraged, offered their services, there's no case and no crime. As the court stated, everyone was in a kind of agreement The girls agreed that they would take money from 50 to 250 zlotys each time. The men agreed to be with them and to pay. So it's a kind of agreement, so to speak, an oral one. And that's the only one that applies. Why am I talking about this? Because it seems that we are crossing more and more boundaries, that something which used to be a crime is no longer considered a crime today. Something that used to be morally condemned is no longer condemned in the same way today. So more and more boundaries are being crossed. How far can these boundaries be crossed? Until eventually there just won't be any boundaries left. Some people say that the boundary is freedom, the freedom of another person. But is that really the case when it comes to a 16-year-old girl? Aren't those boundaries of sexual freedom actually being crossed? Of course, that's open for discussion. Perhaps, well, I would say something that we know from history. That's the famous exclamation of Cicero. O tempora, o mores, o the times, o the customs. Cicero shouted that hundreds of years ago. Our grandparents discussed it, and so did we as parents. So maybe there's nothing extraordinary about it. It's just a change of times and a change of customs. And basically, we could end the topic just like that. There are orphanages, and in those orphanages, there are girls. Someone might say they're demoralized. Well, that's tough. They were unlucky in life. If they want to do it, they just do it. But not exactly. Well, I would say on the basis of all this, another topic arises. And what about the other children? With those children who have normal families, who live, let's say, in a home with a stable foundation, there's a dad, there's a mom, or someone is raising them alone, but there aren't any major problems. Such research was published recently. They studied children, because that's how it should be described, aged from 13 to 16 years old. They were asked what they know about children, or rather minors, undressing in front of a camera. It seemed that this was rather a marginal topic. However, out of the 1,000 children surveyed, 8% said they had seen their peers undressing on various erotic chat sites. Out of those 1,000 children, 2% said they do it themselves, that they go to such sites, undress there, and other things happen there as well. Why do they do it? Well, to make money. It's not really a lot of money. It could be store vouchers, it could be top-ups for a mobile phone, or it could be payment in the form of so-called bitcoins. So all kinds of options are used here, and it looks like if we consider the number of children who have said this, the problem is starting to get big. How do such transactions happen? It's very simple. There are erotic websites. Of course, they are mainly dedicated to adults, but a child can easily access such a website as well. And there are people there who look for such children. Of course, first there's curiosity, then the curiosity to try, and then the possibility to make money. When you're 13 or 14 years old and you see the chance to make a few hundred zlotys, it can be tempting, and it really is tempting. A girl gets an offer to undress to show her breasts. And that's the first moment like that. Most of those kids who go in there aren't aware that they're being recorded. During these studies, it turned out that almost 43% don't know, don't suspect, and don't consider that the person making such proposals is simply recording them. And today the girl is 13 or 14 years old. In a few years, she will be an adult girl and then a woman. Her photos, her video will never disappear from the internet. It's not just a possibility for blackmail, because taking off her shirt could simply be just the first stage. And in adult life, you never know who will be using that video or those photos. So it could be something that simply causes some terrible consequences later in life. That's the first thing to consider. Many of these videos, these video chat conversations or content from these sites also end up on pornographic websites. They are there, they remain there practically for many years. And that's the second thing. So this is, I would say, we're also making this episode so that parents are aware of this. Once addressed to children minors who are also aware of what can happen, but also for parents that just because the child is in the other room sitting at the computer, supposedly studying, well, that might not necessarily be true. That's the first thing. And secondly, if some gadgets or something new appear, it's not necessarily borrowed from a friend. We're saying this so that you're sometimes aware of it too. Of course, the administrator of such a website can see that there's a kid sitting in front of the camera, undressing, whether it's a boy or a girl. Theoretically, they could block her access to such a website, but they don't do that, probably because they simply make money from it. Maybe it would be possible to create laws or regulations that would force those who run such websites to do this. But that's also a topic for discussion. And there's another study that I just remembered right now. There was a study conducted by people who have been working on this topic for many years. They asked young people, let's call them young people because sometimes these are kids aged 14 to 17, whether they pay for various forms of sex. As many as 20% of those surveyed said yes. 20% in this age group, well, that gives a really large number. And now, if we think about it in a logical way, a teenager, a minor, doesn't have much money. It might just be some pocket money from their parents. So who are they paying for sex? Are they going to go to a prostitute? Probably not. It seems like they're also somehow taking advantage of other minors from this particular form of various kinds of sex. The fact that teenagers pay for sex, it seems that they're also paying other teenagers for sex. As I said, we filmed this episode. It's a bit different than the one, I would say, that's obviously about various kinds of murders or gruesome things. This one isn't obvious. It's debatable. You're definitely going to have some disagreements. As we can see, there are plenty of these discussions. We want to spark exactly this kind of debate. Is this another shift in customs and basically there are no problems, or is there actually a problem? Because in some way it devastates the mind of a person who is just entering adulthood. Or maybe if the law doesn't regulate this in some way, you just need to use common sense, like a certain store owner to whom two 16-year-old girls came offering their services. In court, he said that when he found out how old they were, he simply chased the brats away. And that's it for today's episode. Of course, subscribe to our channel and just take care.